Hey everyone, I'm Alex and this is Big Al Books, here today to do my top 10 favorite books that I read in 2017. And usually when I put together this list, it is like agony for me to try to go through all the books that I read and pick out ones that are the best or my favorites. This year was different. It felt very clear to me when I sat down putting this list together which books stood out to me the most. So that was nice. I thought it would be nice to film in front of the fire, make things all cozy, but I've been filming for 30 seconds and it's already like way too hot, so say goodbye to this and let's get started with the list. I'm going to start off this list with Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson. Eden Robinson is a Haisla and Heiltsuk author. She is from British Columbia, and that's part of the reason I loved this book so much, because the setting is just gorgeous. Like, coastal British Columbia is my favorite place in the world, so this book is just truly beautiful. The main character, Lisa Marie, travels along the coast in a small boat trying to find her missing brother. So there's kind of this mystery aspect to the plot set in the present, but Lisa Marie also reflects on her childhood. So there are two different narratives going on. And the childhood section was a lot of fun. And I normally am kind of annoyed by childhood sections, but I thought Lisa Marie was a really feisty and fun kid. And she also has these sort of psychic powers where she sees this strange leprechaun man before bad things happen to her. So it's a really quirky and strange book. It can be delightful at times, but it can also be really dark and heavy. So I really appreciated how Eden Robinson could conjure up a wide variety of moods within this book. The second half of this novel is definitely weaker than the first half, but still, I really enjoyed getting to know Lisa Marie as a character. I appreciated getting to learn more about Haisla culture and mythology, and I'm just so glad that I finally got around to reading Eden Robinson. Next up on this list is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. This is a long Victorian novel that is totally worth the page count because Thackeray is just tearing apart Victorian society and he is having a lot of fun while he's doing that because this novel is set up like it's a puppet show and he calls it Vanity Fair and the characters are just little dolls that he's controlling, so it's a lot of fun. Thackeray is kind of a deranged puppet master because he can be so critical of his characters and he can be so cruel about them, yet there are also moments of real tenderness and kindness where he tries to portray them as these fully fleshed out people with emotions, so I thought that was a really interesting dynamic. Like, this is a satire, but there is a heart beating somewhere under all the shadiness of this book. This book is a product of the Victorian era, but I found it so relevant as a modern reader, and I think that our society is still trapped in Vanity Fair. I'd say now more so than ever, where people are just so obsessed with appearances and with money and status and just having people think that they're better than they are. So this book is really engaging. There's a great plot, great cast of characters, and a lot of really cutting observations. The next book on this list is one of the strangest and most challenging things that I read this year, and that was Hopscotch by Julio Cortazar. You might remember this book from my July wrap-up. It's the book with the atrocious cover that I water damaged after accidentally dropping in the toilet. So this book and I had a very complicated relationship over the month that it took me to make it through this book. It's famous for its structure, so basically you're hopping around between chapters. You don't read it like a linear book, you know, you go on chapter 30, then you're over to chapter 155 and back and forth. So it's like a very disorienting reading experience because you just don't know when the book is ever going to be over and you feel like you're really consumed in this work and lost in it. So I really like how Cortazar almost changes the reading experience and the role of being a reader. It's about this guy who essentially thinks a lot about stuff but doesn't really do a lot of stuff. So we see him at a few different times in his life. There's one time where he's living in Paris and he's friends with these douchebaggy intellectuals and he's like a terrible boyfriend. Then we also see him when he goes back home to Argentina and starts working at a mental hospital. So like, really strange book. A lot of weird meditations on reality and the nature of literature and action. You know, can we make social change, or is it better to just disengage and not be involved? So there's just so many passages that just like broke my brain trying to figure them out. So even though some parts of the story drove me crazy and a lot of the male characters were the worst, this book had me thinking a lot. It changed what a novel could be, so for that reason, it's here on the list. The next book on this list is Ravensong by Leigh Maracle. Leigh Maracle is an author from the Stolo First Nation, and like Monkey Beach, this is a coming-of-age tale set in beautiful British Columbia, so I've clearly got a thing for BC, if that was not already apparent. Anyway, this is a gorgeous book about a girl named Stacy who grows up in a traditional First Nations village, and then she has to leave to go to school in the white part of town, and she starts meeting these Canadians, and she realizes that there's a real disconnect between the two cultures. One of my favorite lines from this book was, "Where do you begin telling someone their world is not the only one?" So Stacy is trying to navigate these two cultures, and this can be a really difficult process for her. So Leigh Maracle is trying to highlight the differences between the two communities, and sometimes she uses humor. So there's one scene where Stacy goes to dinner at her white friend's house, and she is just like blown away with how awkward and weird this white family is and how passive-aggressive everyone is. So that scene was really entertaining. But she also mentions some really serious issues as well. So the First Nations community experiences fire and disease, and they're not receiving the same care and medical help that the white community would. So there are some really serious repercussions. And as well, there's kind of this mythical prophetic element to this book, because the Cedar and Raven are watching over this town, watching everything go down, and they kind of know that this community isn't going to survive and they are going to have to be assimilated into that white community. So there's a really heavy element hanging over this book, but it was a really incredible reading experience. I took it out from the library, and this book is actually really hard to find a copy of, so I was kind of sad that I didn't own one. And then one day it showed up at a Value Village in Cambridge, and I was so excited to find this book. I really thought it was a sign, because this was one of my favorite reads of the year, and I was so glad to find a copy of it. Up next is Buddenbrooks, The Decline of a Family by Thomas Mann. This is a book set at the beginning of the 1900s, and it's about a German merchant family. So at the start of the novel, they are very prosperous and well respected, but as the successive generations go along, we realize that this is a family in financial, emotional, and spiritual decline. And I won't lie to you, this book can be very long and it can be very slow going. It's not all just like excitement and big events, but you do get this really rich portrayal about what it means to be in this family and in this society at the time. So it's worth it, you know, it's not all just the exciting parts of life. There is some of that, but it's also the slow moments as well. And there's some great scenes in here about, you know, a boy's just day at school, what that was like to be a schoolboy at the time, or what summer vacation was like. So you go through all these little moments and they slowly start to build up into this larger picture. The most incredible thing about this book is that Thomas Mann was my age when he published this book, and it is so full of maturity and these profound insights about life. For example, there's this one character who comes to the depressing realization that it's more exciting to have hopes and dreams in your head than it is to actually achieve those dreams, because the reality is never going to be as wonderful as the dream or the picture in your head was going to be. And then the same character also has these crazy epiphanies about what it means to die and how that can be such a liberating and freeing experience. And then he wakes up the next day and forgets all about his epiphany and goes on to live his sad, depressing life. So like there is a lot going on in this book. It had me thinking about family dynamics and society's expectations and what it means to be a person living a meaningful life. So for those reasons, this was one of the most incredible books that I read this year, and I will definitely be reading a lot more Thomas Mann going on in the future. We are now moving in to the top 5, and I have another European classic for you, and that is Pere Goriot by Honore de Balzac. And this is a story set in Paris. We've got the King Lear subplot about an old man who is just giving all his money and his devotion to his 2 spoiled daughters who don't really appreciate it. And then we have the Gossip Girl plot with this young man who comes to Paris. He's not from a very wealthy family, but he wants to succeed in high society, even though he doesn't have the means to keep up with his rich friends. And it's kind of this tale about morality and how willing are you pushing those moral boundaries to fit in and to maintain this lifestyle. So he really has to know how far he's willing to go. And the plot in this book is just so exciting and outrageous. The characters are so memorable, and this book actually ends with one of the characters declaring war on society. So that is one of the best endings to a book I have ever read, because it is just so over the top. But this book is just like, it's a lot of fun, and it was the first Balzac novel that I had ever read, and I know that I'll be reading a lot more from him in the future because I really enjoyed myself reading this book. I'm clearly very enthusiastic about this book because just now I'm getting so excited talking about this book that I'm like, why isn't this #1 on my list? This is the best book I've read ever. But anyway, I'm not going to change the order. Is what it is at this point. So moving along, the next book on this list is The Book of Night Women by Marlon James, who is one of my favorite authors. I didn't think that Marlon James's first 2 novels could come close to how great A Brief History of 7 Killings was, but The Book of Night Women really does give 7 Killings a run for its money. This book is bananas. So it is set on a slave plantation in Jamaica in the 1700s. So if you know anything about slavery at that time, it was brutal. So it is a violent story. It's a disturbing story. It's also a coming-of-age tale. It's the story of Lilith, who is growing up on this plantation, and her life gets really complicated and difficult when she becomes romantically involved with one of the white people working on the plantation. She also becomes involved with a group of women who secretly meet up in the middle of the night to plan an uprising. So Lilith is just torn between her loyalties to these different groups of people, and you just really feel for how confusing and conflicting her identity becomes, even though she is not always a sympathetic character. In Marlon James's world, characters are never simple, and you can never reduce them to just good or bad. Every character in this book is complicated. So it's such a rich reading experience. This book, like I said, is so violent and so disturbing, and yet it was a page turner. I read this almost in a day because I just couldn't put it down. I was so immersed in this world, yet I also had to leave because it was ruining my life. You're just so transported into this story. This book was such a powerful read, so emotionally engaging. So if you can handle the graphic content and the Jamaican patois, I would totally recommend giving this one a go because Marlon James is a master. The next book is actually the only book on this list that was released in 2017, and that was Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. And I don't care what anyone else has to say about this book. I know a lot of people aren't feeling it, or a lot of people are happy that it won the Man Booker. I really don't care what the world thinks about this book because reading it was such an intensely personal experience that my emotional engagement with this book is really what matters to me about this book. And the cool form and style is one thing, but really this book was all about how it made me feel because I felt so deeply and I really had to think about death, which is hard for me. So this book was just a wild ride and I loved it so much, even though it's one of those books that like I want to reread, but I never want to reread because I never want to go through that pain again. Like there's so much loss in this book, but there's also so much hope. So it's a really conflicting book, but it is just so beautiful. Also, the Civil War material is like really interesting. You get to learn a bit more about Lincoln and American society at the time. Lincoln is really messed up in this book because he knows how terrible it is to lose your child, and yet he is leading on the Civil War, and he's causing thousands of parents to go through the exact same horrible experience that he's going through when he continues this war. So he is a man that is going through a very conflicted time of his life. So the Lincoln stuff is really interesting, but for me, really, it was all about the scenes in the graveyard, the voices from the afterlife, just imagining the possibility of what that afterlife might entail, letting go of what we know as humans and individuals. This book just had me thinking so much, and it had me feeling even more. So it's a real testament to how powerful books can be in your life. If Lincoln and the Bardo had me feeling a lot of things, then The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon had me thinking a lot of things. This book is so short. It's only 150 pages, but it really got my brain going. This is a book about a woman named Oedipa whose life becomes entangled in this mysterious conspiracy, and you don't really know if she's just losing her mind or if there actually is some kind of conspiracy at play, but either way, it's a fascinating journey, and Oedipa is trying to piece everything together and make sense of a world that maybe just can't be made sense of, and it is kind of a frustrating ending in that there's not a lot of resolution, but that's kind of what life is in a postmodern kind of way. So this book is fun. There are a lot of riddles in here. There's a whole Jacobean revenge drama in here. Like there's just a lot happening in very few pages, and that's what I think is so impressive about this book. There are definitely moments of silliness and humor in this book, but there are some profound flashes of insight where I felt like Thomas Pynchon is some kind of genius. Like there's this scene where he's comparing the DTs, you know, the sickness that affects alcoholics, with DTs in calculus, which is a time differential. And it's like, who is this person that is comparing alcoholics with these, you know, abstract concepts of math? Like he's got a brilliant mind, and he writes about entropy and all these other advanced, you know, scientific concepts that like go right over my head, but I have a lot of fun trying to keep up with him. So I was really impressed with this book and so glad that I picked it up. And finally, the best book that I read this year is a book that is considered by many people to be the best book of all time, period. And I can definitely see where they're coming from. And that is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. And going into this book, I thought that it was going to be tedious because it's like 1,000 pages about a crazy guy who thinks that he's a knight and just his adventures. Like I thought that that was just going to be kind of repetitive and dull, but I was going to read this book because I felt obligated to, you know, because you kind of have to read Don Quixote at one point, is the way I felt. So I was so surprised and delighted by just how much I enjoyed this book the whole way through. So this book was not boring at all, and it was one of those books where I got to the end and I was like so sad that it was over. Like this book could just continue on for infinity, and I think that would be great. And when I finished it, I started reading it again in a different translation, and I was just so happy to be back in that world. Like I truly grew to love Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Like they are just people that I feel that I know, and it's just like a comfort zone now, just going back and engaging with these characters again. And some of their adventures are silly and slapstick and just ridiculous, but sometimes their adventures are darker or more mysterious and question the nature of reality while being funny at the same time. So that's what's great about this book, is it has so many big ideas and thoughts about literature and reality as we know it, but it's just always entertaining. It never gets pretentious. Cervantes is such a great storyteller. I really loved part 2 of this book because it's almost a parody of part 1, and Cervantes is responding to the criticism that he received. He's responding to a fake version of Don Quixote that came out in between the time that the 2 books were released. So it is so postmodern, it's so ahead of its time. This book is such a treasure, and I feel like really grateful that it's a part of my life now, because I've gone back and revisited some parts of this book and it really made me so happy, brought me so much joy, and I love that that's something that I'm gonna get to do for the rest of my life now. It is like making a new friend. Like whenever I need a literary pick-me-up, I can always return back to these pages, which is really exciting, and that's why this is my book of the year. That's it for my list. Those were my favorite books that I read this year. I'd love to hear what your favorite books were that you read this year, because I'm always planning ahead, getting that 2018 TBR going. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you all have a wonderful end to your 2017. Thanks. Bye.